Part 1. Ambassador had served humanity among the stars for 23 years. She had negotiated trade agreements with species made of living crystal. She had mediated disputes between civilizations that communicated through color and scent. She had once spent 6 months learning to speak in magnetic pulses just to say hello to the cluster mind. Nothing in her long career had prepared her for this moment. The message had arrived at midnight, Earth Standard Time. It came sealed with 17 layers of encryption and bore the mark of the archivists. In 300 years of galactic membership, humanity had received exactly 4 communications from the archivists. Each one had changed the course of human history. This was the 5th. The shuttle that collected her was not the usual diplomatic transport. It was old, older than human, and it hummed with technology that made her teeth ache. The pilot was a creature of folded geometry that hurt to look at directly. It said nothing during the journey, was grateful for the silence. The obsidian citadel hung in the void between galaxies, a structure so vast that planets could have orbited within its hollow chambers. It was said that the archivists had built it before the first stars formed. It was said that they had witnessed the birth of time itself. It was said many things about the archivists, and suspected that most of them were true. She was not taken to the diplomatic wing. She was not taken to the general archives, where scholars of 1,000 species studied the accumulated knowledge of galactic history. Instead, her escort led her through corridors that grew darker and older with each step, until they reached a door marked with symbols that predated language. The Forbidden Wing. Had heard rumors of this place. Every ambassador had. It was where the archivists kept knowledge too dangerous for general circulation, weapons that could unmake reality, philosophies that drove entire civilizations mad, secrets that had ended species. The door opened without sound and stepped inside. The chamber beyond was circular and dark, lit only by floating motes of pale light that drifted like snow. At its center stood a being that's mind struggled to process. It was tall, perhaps 3 meters, and it seemed to exist in more dimensions than her eyes could perceive. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like a memory of sound. Ambassador, thank you for coming. Chief Archivist, she bowed in the manner she had been taught. I am honored by your summons, though I admit I am confused by its nature. You will understand shortly. The chief archivist gestured, and the floating lights coalesced into a holographic display. Are you familiar with the Cosmic Horror Index? Frowned, I have heard the name. A catalog of some kind. A catalog, yes. We maintain a comprehensive ranking of the most psychologically devastating practices ever devised by any species in galactic history. The archivist's form shifted and sensed something that might have been discomfort. It exists as a warning system. When a species demonstrates capacity for certain levels of creative cruelty, we flag them for observation. In extreme cases, we recommend quarantine. I see, kept her voice neutral. And what does this have to do with humanity? The archivist was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice had changed. It was softer, smaller, almost afraid. 300 years ago, when humanity joined the collective, we began the standard process of translating and cataloging your historical records. It is a lengthy process. Your species has been remarkably prolific in documenting itself. We do like to write things down. Yes, the archivist paused. The translation team completed their work 6 standard months ago. The findings were unexpected. Waited. 3 of my archivists have requested memory dissolution. They wish to forget what they learned. The translation team had to be rotated every 6 hours to prevent psychological collapse. We have existed since before your sun ignited, Ambassador. We have cataloged the horrors of 10,000 civilizations. We have witnessed atrocities that have no words in any language. The archivist turned to face her directly, and for the first time saw something she recognized in that impossible form. She saw fear. Nothing prepared us for humanity. The holographic display shifted, and a list appeared. It was long, stretching beyond what could see, entries marked with numbers and names and classifications she did not understand. The Cosmic Horror Index, the archivist said. 17 of the top 50 positions are now occupied by human practices. Stared at the list. She saw names she recognized, names from history lessons she had tried to forget, names that had given her nightmares as a child. "We are not threatening you, Ambassador." The archivist's voice was almost gentle. "We do not have the power to threaten you. If your species decided to turn its creativity toward conquest, we could not stop you. No one could stop you. We would never." "We know, that is what terrifies us most." The archivist gestured at the list. "These practices were not invented by monsters. They were invented by artists and engineers and scholars. They were invented by species members who loved their children and wrote poetry and gazed at stars with wonder. The same minds that created your music and mathematics also created this." The list scrolled and saw an entry highlighted in red, entry number 12, the Brazen Bull. "You designed an execution device specifically to convert screams into music," the archivist said. "The acoustic engineering alone required genius-level understanding of sound propagation. But you did not stop at efficiency. You made it beautiful. You made the suffering into art." "Felt sick? That was thousands of years ago. We are not the same species we were then." "We know." The archivist moved closer and resisted the urge to step back. "That is why we summoned you, not to condemn, to understand." The display changed again, showing a new entry. Number 7, White Room Torture. "No physical contact," the archivist said. "No visible harm. You learn to destroy minds by removing stimulation, by creating a void. This requires understanding consciousness at a level we have not achieved. We have studied the brain structures of 10,000 species. We could not have invented this. We would not have thought to try. It was banned, outlawed. We recognized it as evil and we stopped." "Yes, that is the other thing we do not understand." The archivist's form shifted again, uncertainty rippling through its impossible geometry. "You invented these horrors. You practiced them for centuries, and then you stopped. You wrote laws against them. You built museums to remember the victims. You taught your children about the darkness so they would not repeat it." The list vanished, replaced by a simple question floating in the air. "How? How do you contain such capacity for cruelty?" the archivist asked. "How do you wake each morning knowing what you are capable of and choose to be something else? We have watched species tear themselves apart when they discovered what lurked in their own natures. We have seen civilizations collapse into madness when they realized what they could become. But humanity discovered its darkness and simply continued." "How?" Was silent for a long time. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived horrors she never spoke of. She thought about her father, who had dedicated his life to preventing such horrors from happening again. She thought about her daughter, who slept peacefully on a world that had never known war. "I don't have a good answer," she finally said. "We struggle with it every day. We fail sometimes. We fall back into darkness sometimes, but we keep trying, we keep choosing." The archivist considered this. "The collective has existed for billions of years. In all that time, we have encountered precisely 0 species with your capacity for creative cruelty. We have also encountered precisely 0 species with your capacity for creative mercy. The two appear to be linked." "Maybe they are." "Perhaps." The archivist moved toward a doorway had not noticed before. "Tomorrow, you will appear before a tribunal. Representatives of the elder species wish to hear your testimony. They need to understand what humanity is, what humanity could become." "And what happens after I testify?" The archivist paused at the threshold. When it spoke, its voice was heavy with something that might have been age or might have been sorrow. "That depends entirely on your answers, Ambassador. and on whether the collective can accept the truth about the species we have welcomed into our midst. The door closed, leaving alone with the floating lights and the weight of human history pressing down upon her shoulders. She did not sleep that night. Part 2. The tribunal chamber was vast beyond reason, stood at its center on a platform of polished stone that floated in empty space. Around her, rising in tiers that vanished into darkness, sat the representatives of species older than Earth itself. Some attended in person. She could see the crystalline forms of their bodies catching light and scattering it into rainbows. She could see the collective mind of a swirling mass of electromagnetic consciousness contained in a sphere of unknown metal. She could see dozens of others, beings of gas and light and living mathematics. Many more attended as holograms. They had refused to be in the same physical space as a human, tried not to take it personally. The chief archivist floated at the head of the assembly, its form more stable now, more defined. Beside it sat a creature that did not recognize, ancient beyond measure, its body like twisted silver and frozen lightning. "This tribunal is convened," the chief archivist announced. "Ambassador of Earth will provide testimony regarding the Cosmic Horror Index entries attributed to her species. She has agreed to answer any questions put to her honestly and completely." Nodded, her throat was dry. She had spent the sleepless night preparing for this moment, but no preparation could have been enough. The first question came from the representative, its voice like wind chimes in a storm. Entry number 12, the Brazen Bull, explain. Took a breath. It was invented approximately 2,700 years ago by a metal worker named. He designed it for a tyrant named ruler of a city called. We know the facts. We want to understand the motivation. Wanted a method of execution that would frighten his enemies. Wanted to impress him with his craftsmanship. Paused. It was cruelty in service of power, and art in service of cruelty. The acoustic tubes that converted screams into music, the pressed. Was this a deliberate design choice? Yes. The chamber fell silent, could feel the weight of countless eyes upon her, judging, measuring. According to the records, she continued, was so disgusted by the invention that he tested it on himself, and later was overthrown by his own people, who executed him in the same device. You are saying the creators were punished. I am saying that even then we recognized the horror. Even then there were limits we tried to enforce. The next question came from a holographic figure, a being of pure geometry that could barely perceive. Entry number 23, Rat Torture, explain. Closed her eyes briefly. This one was worse somehow, more personal. A prisoner would be restrained. A container holding rats would be placed against their body, usually the stomach. The container would then be heated. The rats, desperate to escape the heat, would burrow through the prisoner to escape. You weaponized another creature's survival instinct against your own kind. Yes. The psychological understanding required to devise this, the geometric being said, is considerable. You had to understand both the behavior of the rats and the psychology of the victim. You had to predict how fear and pain would interact. This is not simple cruelty. This is engineering. Had no response, what could she say? The questions continued. The Judas cradle, the Iron Maiden, keel-hauling. Each one dragged from the darkest corners of human history, each one forcing to explain the unexplainable. And then they reached entry number 7, White Room Torture. No physical harm, said a being that appeared as living shadow. No visible wounds. Explain how this functions. The subject is placed in a completely white room, said. White walls, white floor, white ceiling, white clothing, white food on white plates. No shadows, no colors, no variation whatsoever. They are given no schedule, no sense of time passing, no human contact, no sound. And the result? Complete psychological breakdown, usually within days. The human mind requires stimulation. Without it, it begins to destroy itself. The shadow being rippled with something that might have been horror. You discovered a method to torture consciousness itself, without touching the body at all. Yes, this requires understanding of the mind that exceeds our own capabilities. We have studied brain structures for billions of years. We could not have invented this. I know. That is not a comfort. The questions paused. The assembly murmured among itself, sounds and signals that could not interpret. She waited, hands clasped behind her back, fighting the urge to defend herself, to explain that these horrors were ancient, that humanity had changed, that they were better now. But had they? Could they truly claim to have transcended their nature? Then the ancient being beside the chief archivist spoke. Its voice was like ice cracking across a frozen lake, deep and slow and impossibly cold. I am Prime. My species founded the collective before your sun ignited. We have watched civilizations rise and fall for longer than you can comprehend. Inclined her head respectfully. They have never appeared on the Cosmic Horror Index. The ancient being paused. Do you know why? I assume because your species was never capable of such cruelty. You assume incorrectly. The chamber fell absolutely silent. They have never appeared on the Cosmic Horror Index, Prime continued, because we never needed torture. We never needed methods of cruelty. When a species threatened us, we simply erased them from existence. Completely, utterly, without exception. Felt the words settle into her chest like stones. 47, Prime said. That is how many species they have eliminated over our history. Entire civilizations reduced to scattered atoms. We were efficient. We were thorough. We left no survivors to document what we had done. Why are you telling me this? Because I have sat in this chamber for 600 years, judging other species for their crimes. The ancient being's form shifted and sensed something like shame emanating from it. And I have never once been forced to answer for my own. We have always believed ourselves superior to younger species, cleaner, more evolved. But listening to your testimony, I find myself wondering. Wondering what? Which is worse, Ambassador? Prime's voice dropped lower, colder. A species that invents unimaginable cruelty and then chooses to remember it, to learn from it, to teach its children about the darkness so they might recognize it and resist it. Or a species that simply eliminates any threat so efficiently that it never needs to develop moral understanding at all. The chamber erupted in noise. Signals flashed between the assembled beings. Holograms flickered with agitation. The chief archivist raised a manipulator for silence, but the chaos continued. We have no museums to our crimes, the ancient being continued, speaking over the din. We have no laws against what we did. We have no word for it because we never conceived of it as wrong. We simply acted and moved on. Clean, efficient, and utterly without the moral growth that comes from confronting one's own capacity for evil. The noise gradually subsided. All eyes turned to. Ambassador, the chief archivist said, you have heard the questions and the confessions. You have seen how the elder species react to human history. What would you have us understand? Was quiet for a long moment. She thought of Prime's words. She thought of the 47 species that no longer existed. She thought of the human horrors documented in the index, terrible and creative and ultimately survived. I would have you understand this, she finally said. We are not proud of what we have done. We are horrified by it. Every human child learns of these things so that they will never forget what we are capable of becoming. We preserve our darkness because forgetting it would be the greatest sin of all. She looked directly at Prime. And I would have you understand that the capacity for horror and the capacity for growth may not be separable. You cannot learn to resist evil if you never acknowledge its existence. You cannot choose to be better if you never admit that you could be worse. The chief archivist considered this. You are saying that humanity's cruelty is linked to humanity's capacity for change. I am saying that we invented ways to torture each other, and then we invented ways to stop. We created the horrors, and then we created the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Criminal Court. We built the darkness, and then we built lights to hold it back. She spread her hands, a gesture of openness, of vulnerability. We are still building. We are still failing sometimes. We are still capable of every horror on your index, but we are also still choosing every day to be something else. And that choice, that constant struggle, is the most human thing about us. Part 3. 6 months had passed since the tribunal. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one had predicted. Ambassador stood at the window of her office on Earth, watching the sun set over an ocean that had once known the blood of naval warfare and now carried only ships of commerce and pleasure. Behind her, a holographic display showed news from across the collective. They had begun their own reckoning. Prime had returned home after the tribunal and spoken publicly of the 47. The reaction had been volcanic. For the first time in billions of years, they were forced to confront what their clean efficiency had truly cost. It had not been easy. Had watched the reports of civil unrest, of turning against as ancient secrets came to light. 3 colony worlds had declared independence. The ruling council had dissolved twice, but through it all, something was happening that had never happened before. They were remembering. They were building monuments to the species they had destroyed. They were creating words for what they had done. They were teaching their children about the darkness so that it might never be repeated. They were learning to be horrified by themselves. They had undertaken similar examinations. So had the collective mind of. One by one, the elder species were opening their own archives, confronting their own forgotten sins. The Cosmic Horror Index had grown by 3,000 entries in 6 months, not because new horrors had been invented, but because old ones were finally being remembered. A chime sounded and turned from the window. Her aide appeared in the doorway. "Ambassador, they're here." Nodded and made her way to the reception hall. Waiting for her was a delegation unlike any she had ever received. 15 species, all of them younger than humanity in galactic terms, all of them watching her with eyes and sensors and perceptual organs that gleamed with something she was not used to seeing. Hope. The leader of the delegation was a being from a species called a bipedal creature covered in soft blue fur. It stepped forward and performed the traditional greeting bow. "Ambassador, we have come to learn." "Learn what?" "Everything." This voice was earnest, almost desperate. "We have studied the tribunal transcripts. We have read your histories. We have seen what humanity was capable of and what humanity chose to become." "And that brought you here?" "Yes," the gestured to its companions. "We are all young species. We are all still discovering what we are capable of. Some of us have already begun to develop technologies and practices that could be turned toward cruelty. We have seen it happening and we have been afraid." Nodded slowly. She understood that fear. She had lived with it her entire life. "But when we studied your history," they continued, "we found something we had not expected. You did not simply avoid cruelty. You invented cruelty, practiced cruelty, documented cruelty, and then invented ways to stop it. You created the darkness and the light. You created the disease and the cure." "We did. We want to understand how." Thus eyes were bright with intensity. "Not the methods of torture. Those we could learn from any species with sufficient cruelty and creativity. What we want to understand is the other thing. The thing no other species seems to have created." "What thing?" "The tools of mercy." This voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Your species invented prison reform, rehabilitation instead of punishment, restorative justice, truth and reconciliation processes. You created entire frameworks for turning enemies into neighbors, for transforming victims and oppressors alike into something new. We have studied the records. No other species in the collective has done this. No other species has even tried. Felt something shift in her chest. In all the discussions about the Cosmic Horror Index, in all the questions about humanity's capacity for cruelty, she had never considered this angle. She had been so focused on defending humanity against its darkness that she had forgotten to speak of its light. The same creativity that invented the horrors, she said slowly, invented the solutions. We are very good at causing suffering, and because we understood suffering so well, we became very good at ending it too. That is what we wish to learn, not the suffering, the ending. The delegation stayed for 3 months, brought in historians and psychologists and philosophers. She arranged visits to museums and courtrooms and reconciliation centers. She showed them the mechanisms that humanity had built, piece by piece, to hold back its own darkness. They took notes, they asked questions, they struggled to understand. And then they went home to build their own lights. The chief archivist arrived on Earth 6 months later. It was the first time an archivist had visited any world in recorded history. The event made headlines across the galaxy. Met it in the garden of the diplomatic center, under a sky filled with stars that humanity had only begun to explore. The archivist's form was different here, softer somehow, more present. It moved among the flowers with something like wonder. "I have existed since before your son was born," the archivist said. "I have never walked on a planet before. Welcome to Earth." "Thank you." The archivist paused beside a rose bush, examining the blooms with senses that could not comprehend. "I have come to tell you something." "What?" "The Cosmic Horror Index is being retired." Blinked, retired. It was always an incomplete measure. We catalogued capacity for cruelty, but cruelty alone tells us nothing of importance. The killed billions and never appeared on our list. Your species invented horrors that made my archivists weep, and you are the most morally advanced species we have ever encountered. That seems like a strong statement. It is simply the truth. The archivist turned to face her directly. We are creating something new, a study of transformation, of how species change, of how darkness can be acknowledged and integrated rather than forgotten and humanity. The first entry. The archivist's form rippled with something that might have been warmth. Case study, humanity. We have summarized it in a single phrase. What phrase? Monsters who chose not to be. Was silent. The words settled over her like a blessing and a burden, an acknowledgement of everything her species had been and everything it had decided to become. Still choosing, the archivist added. Still failing sometimes. Still capable of every horror on our old index, but still choosing every day to be something else. That is what makes you important, not your capacity for cruelty. Any species can learn cruelty. What makes you important is that you chose to be better despite knowing exactly what you could be. And you think other species can learn from that. I know they can. The delegation has already implemented 3 of your frameworks. They have begun their own truth and reconciliation processes. The galaxy is changing, Ambassador, because of you, because of what humanity proved was possible. The archivist moved toward the garden's exit, then paused. There is one more thing. Yes. The Cosmic Mercy Catalog, the companion index we have created to measure capacity for redemption and transformation. The archivist's voice was soft. Humanity ranks first. Shook her head. We're not the most merciful species. We have so far to go. That is precisely the point. The archivist's form began to fade, preparing for its journey back to the Citadel. Other species evolved past violence. Their brains simply do not produce aggressive impulses. They never needed mercy because they never needed to overcome anything. But humanity invented mercy while retaining full capability for horror. Every act of kindness your species commits is a victory over its own darkness. Every choice to build rather than destroy is a triumph of will. The archivist was almost gone now, just a shimmer of folded dimensions against the evening sky. "We have studied 10,000 species," it said, voice echoing from somewhere far away. "Yours is the only one that made cruelty creative, mercy deliberate, and growth possible. You are monsters who chose not to be, and you are still choosing, still human." Then it was gone. Stood alone in the garden, watching the stars emerge one by one. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was learning to remember its own darkness. Somewhere out there, species were building their own lights. And here on Earth, humanity continued its eternal struggle. The same creativity that had invented the brazen bull had invented the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The same minds that had devised white room torture had devised systems of psychological healing. The same species that had cataloged 1,000 ways to cause suffering had cataloged 1,000 more ways to end it. They were still choosing. They would always be choosing. And that, realized, was the most human thing of all.